Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from Vienna, and welcome to the webinar on COVID-19 measures implemented by states, being held by the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL, in cooperation with the International Comparative Law Research Center of the Russian Federation. Please welcome with me for the opening remarks Ms. Ekaterina Salugina-Sorokovaya, the General Director of the International Comparative Law Research Center of the Russian Federation. She will be followed by Ms. Anna Joubin-Bret, the Secretary of UNCITRAL, and by Mr. Gershanok, the Director of the Legal Department of the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. After the 25 minutes opening remarks, we will have a series of 8 presentations on COVID-19 measures that will be introduced and moderated by myself. So now, without further ado, I would invite Ms. Ekaterina Salugina-Sorokovaya to make her remarks. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Estrella-Faria. I'm glad to welcome everyone at our webinar. If you don't mind, I will be speaking Russian. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Dear colleagues, my name is Ekaterina Salugina-Sorokovaya. I am Director General of International Comparative Law Research Center. Our research, as an independent center, is making a lot of expert work. We are participating in 3 groups of UNCITRAL, and I am very grateful for giving me this opportunity to give a welcome to the participants of the webinar. We all understand that the pandemic of COVID-19 is also a challenge for the law in general, and our center last year decided to make studies in order to understand how the different systems of law respond to the pandemic, and we analyzed the regional and national regulations of different countries, not only the first response to the pandemic, but the next steps in development of the norms and regulations, and also the judicial practice. And I would like to share some of the conclusions that may be useful. Well, at the regional level, there are no regulations of the relations which appear in emergency situations, and the creation of the international regulations would enable the states to make more balanced decisions, and to do that quickly. In some of the states during the pandemic and before the pandemic, there was the special legislation adopted in case of infectious disease spread. And what is interesting is that during the pandemic, even among the unitary states, so from centralization they moved to decentralization of decision-making processes. We believe that decentralization approach can provide for more efficient response to such emergency situations as COVID-19. As for the restrictions and limitations imposed on the populations, they were quite similar. As you know, well, for different jurisdictions in common, they had the restrictions on public gatherings, restrictions on moving, social distancing, and also the need to wear masks. And in response to the pandemic, there were restriction measures imposed of the non-production sector. The cultural, sports, and entertainment facilities were shut down, and also there were exceptions made only for the shops which were selling food and other necessary products, FMCG, and the critically important production facilities were not closed down. I would like to mention that the restriction measures and their extension, well, also triggered lots of cases of in court. So usually these restrictions are usually accepted by the courts as those who have the foundation, and they are characterized by them as the ones protecting the population, in some cases not. These are violations of freedom of public gatherings, freedom of religion, and absence of evidence, scientific evidence, which proves the need for such measures to be imposed. And after massive vaccination, there also were cases in courts related to the access of some population groups to vaccines and vaccinations. We should be very careful with the legal mechanism, and we should provide for the balance in terms of execution of protection rights, and also we need to comply with the human rights. And you can learn the details on the website of our center. And to finish, I would like to thank the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation and UNCITRAL and the Secretary of the UNCITRAL and Joubin-Bret. And it is very important to respond to such a global catastrophe as pandemic of COVID, and we are very happy to cooperate with UNCITRAL and the Ministry of Economic Development of Russia. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam Salugina-Sorokovaya. Now I give the floor to Ms. Anna Joubin-Bret.
Thank you very much, dear Angelo. I would like to acknowledge at the outset and greet Mr. Lev Gershanok, the Director of the Legal Department of the Ministry of Development of the Russian Federation, as well as Ms. Salugina-Sorokovaya, General Director of the International Comparative Law Research Center, dear Ekaterina, because we had the pleasure of meeting before. I would like to express our gratitude to the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation for having brought a project to UNCITRAL that is giving rise to the exploratory work that was conducted together during this year and that we will present at the forthcoming Commission session, and also to the International Center for Comparative Law, which, as Ekaterina has reminded us, is one of the latest NGOs to have been invited to UNCITRAL sessions and to have been also very actively involved in holding a number of webinars and other events during the year. So thank you very much. Very glad for this opportunity to cooperate again. I would just like to recall that we are here today to examine together the findings of a questionnaire that was prepared in partnership with interested governments following the resumed session of the Commission in September of 2020. This questionnaire was circulated in English, French, and Spanish, was sent out to all UNCITRAL members, and we were quite happily surprised to receive many answers. We received answers from 31 states, which gave us a lot of course, food for report. And the report is in front of you now for discussion and to also highlight the main findings. And it is also going to be presented at the Commission in the form of this report, together with a second report prepared by the Secretariat, which is looking closer at what other international organizations are doing in terms of monitoring measures in the area of international trade. And this is also one of the reasons for the presence here of colleagues from the WTO. And I'm glad to say hello to Martin Roy, whom I haven't seen for 20 years. So very nice to see you again, Martin. And also to Raoul Renard, who is one of our old partners in crime when it comes to advocating for more electronic trade and more digital trade. So you will find the take takeaways of these questionnaire summarized in the report. And it is, as I mentioned, only a first part of what will be discussed at the Commission. We're expecting also to discuss at the Commission a proposal that was made last year of establishing a platform on which states could exchange best practices and hear more from what others are doing in the areas that are relevant to UNCITRAL. And this is also a topic we will be discussing during the forthcoming Commission session. So since I know we have a very tight schedule and you have a lot to discuss with many informed experts from governments, I won't take more of your time, but just again to thank you very much for this opportunity to interact on a report by the Secretariat in advance of the Commission session to prepare our discussion during the Commission. Thank you again to the Russian Federation, to Armenia and Vietnam for bringing this project to UNCITRAL, and thank you to the ICLRC for hosting us. Over to you, Angelo.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's now my pleasure and privilege to invite Mr. Lev Gershanok, the Director of Legal Department, the Minister of Economic Development of Russian Federation, to address us. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Good day. I am going to speak in Russian too. The
Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation would like to extend its gratitude to the Secretariat of UNCITRAL, and in particular to Mrs. Anna Joubin-Bret for supporting our initiative to summarize the national measures to support the economics of the states because of the restrictions imposed because of COVID-19. Well, we may see that we need to develop the quick measures to respond to emergence of the new strains of COVID-19. I would like to also thank the International Center for Comparative Law Research for the analysis of the practices and recommendation. We are grateful to Armenia and Vietnam who support the initiative of the Russian Federation, and to other states which were interested in our initiative and who share the experience in fighting this global threat. According to the questionnaire of the member states, demonstrated that the measures were taken and they were just similar, and such measures were also related to insolvency, and also there were limitations on the bankruptcy cases, and there was support to small and medium enterprises. The measures taken by the states also included direct financial aid, benefits and for credits, postpone of payments, restructuring of debts, support for rent, lease payments, and subsidies for salaries. And the direct support was provided to tourism and transport industries, and also electronic services were widened, and also we fostered and supported digital deals, and also there were new international electronic trade platforms that appeared, and also the online dispute measures were supported. The Russian Federation also introduced the measures of support in social economic spheres aimed at the stopping of the spread of the infection to support the business activity in the Russian Federation. My colleague will give more details. In general, the pandemic emphasized the need for international cooperation and coordination at different levels in terms of emergency response or to external challenges, also in part of the legal regulations. The Russian Federation believes that big and authoritative international platforms such as UNCITRAL play a major role in exchange of experience between the states, and also in development of unified rules for actions in such unprecedented situations. We hope that the Commission will continue its consistent work to provide for support to members of the UN to fight against such challenges in the future. I wish you fruitful work and would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gershanok. Now, before we move to the second part of this webinar, which is actually the presentation on COVID-19 measures implemented by states, let me just very briefly again recapitulate the context in which we'll be discussing these measures. As Madame Joubin-Bret has already pointed out, this comes out in the context of a proposal that was made by the government of Russian Federation to UNCITRAL at the 53rd session last year with the support of Armenia and Vietnam, that UNCITRAL should examine the legal implications of measures taken by states to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular disruptions caused to global trade, as well as the potential negative impact that such measures might have on cross-border trade and commerce. In particular, the proposal was for the Secretariat to initiate exploratory work to consider whether such measures had exposed any gaps in the international legal framework or obstacles to cross-border trade and investment that could be overcome by work by UNCITRAL, especially as regards the permissible scope of state interference in contractual obligations, issues of liability of contract parties given the frustration of performance or force majeure, mandatory alteration of terms and performance of obligations, facilitated bankruptcy rules, the digitalization of legal procedures, information and performance of contracts, corporate governance, in particular online voting corporations, and smart contracts. As Madame Joubin-Bret has indicated, one of the steps that we did to that was to send out a questionnaire to member states. We were very positively surprised by the deep and extensive replies that we get from 31 states. They are all summarized in a document that has been published by the Secretariat. It's document A/CN9 1080 on the UNCITRAL website. Now, we're very happy to have with us today a very diverse panel with representatives from states in Africa, Asia, Eastern and Western Europe that will share with us their experience and report on the measures they have taken as they have indicated in our replies to the questionnaire. Our speakers are Ms. Sanjna Rai from the Ministry of Law of Singapore, Ms. Maria Szymańska from the Ministry of Economic Development of Poland, Mr. Alcides Cardoso-Luís from the Ministry of Commerce of Angola, Mr. Nicholas Meyer from the Federal Office of Justice in Switzerland, Mr. Pavel Shilingarayan from the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, Ms. Elina Simonian from the Ministry of Economy of Armenia. And as Madame Joubin-Bret has indicated, we also have with us representatives of two international organizations, one intergovernmental and one private sector. Mr. Martin Roy represented the World Trade Organization, and Mr. Raoul Renard represented the International Chamber of Commerce, was also, as Madame Joubin-Bret indicated, has called for rapid implementation of standards to facilitate electronic commerce. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes, and I would ask the speakers to very kindly make sure that they stay within the time allocated to them, because with 8 speakers, if each speaker exceeds the time by 1 minute, we would have already 8 minutes delay. We do have some flexibility at the end, but we do not like to impose on our co-hosts in Moscow. So now, without further ado, I'll invite the first speaker to address the webinar. And so Ms. Sanjna Rai from Singapore, you have the floor, please.
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of the measures that Singapore has adopted to overcome the consequences of COVID-19. So in Singapore, we have adopted a multi-pronged approach. There were 4 broad categories of measures that we introduced. So there were the temporary measures under an act called the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act, a simplified insolvency program, and there was financial and other similar forms of assistance provided. And lastly, there was support for specific sectors that were affected by COVID-19. For the purposes of today's presentation, I will be focusing on the 2 aspects, the measures under the Act, as well as the Simplified Insolvency Program. So to provide some context, there were several measures that Singapore took and continues to take to prevent the escalation of COVID-19 infections. So these measures included the closure of certain businesses and workplaces for a period of time, restrictions on large gatherings and events, and travel restrictions. So all of these measures impacted the ability of businesses and individuals to conduct the affairs which they conducted previously before COVID-19. So I now turn to the first part of my presentation, the Act. So this was urgent legislation that was passed in Parliament last year on 7th April. Then we introduced amendments throughout the year as the situation continued to evolve. The Act is organized into various parts, and each part relates to a specific set of measures. So I will briefly go through each of these categories. So the first relates to the inability to perform contractual obligations. So part 2 of this Act deals with the inability to perform certain types of contractual obligations. And the key relief measure provided under part 2 is a temporary moratorium against both legal and enforcement action. And the relief measures were designed to apply to contracts that were materially impacted by COVID-19. Therefore, the Act states that relief applies to contracts entered into before the 25th of March, which predated the effect of COVID-19, which we felt significantly in Singapore. The contractual obligations had to be performed on or after the 1st of February. And these relief measures only applied to contracts that were specified in the first schedule to the Act. So that was in secondary legislation or subsidiary legislation. So the buckets of contracts that you see on this slide are the contracts which represent large sectors of our economy. These were the sectors that were greatly impacted by COVID-19. So under the Act, there are generally 3 steps involved in applying for relief. So the first step entails serving a notification for relief on the other party or counterparties of the contract. And the effect of serving a notification for relief, or NFR in short, is that the party who has been served the document is prohibited from taking certain types of legal and enforcement actions. So for example, if I have received an NFR, I cannot commence court proceedings, I cannot enforce security over certain property, I cannot kick a tenant out of the premises. So the relief applied for a duration of time, which is something that the Act refers to a prescribed period. So these are temporary measures, and the period of time for which relief applies is something that the Minister for Law may determine depending on all the circumstances. The last step involves is only engaged if there is a dispute between the parties and counterparties, and these disputes do not go to court. These disputes are determined by people known as assessors, and these assessors are appointed by the Minister of Law. So the dispute resolution, this unique form of dispute resolution, is free, and it was intended to provide an inexpensive but fair resolution for all parties involved. The Act also provided additional relief measures to specific types of contracts. So for construction and supply contracts, the Act provided for defenses in relation to claims for liquidated damages and for delays caused by COVID-19. Then there were additional relief measures for event and tourism related contracts. So by that, we mean things like a hotel accommodation bookings or a booking to hold a large-scale wedding function, for example. So what the Act said was that if a party had paid a deposit upfront and the event or the tour couldn't proceed because of COVID-19, then the vendor, the party receiving the deposit, could not forfeit the deposit, notwithstanding the contractual terms. This is unless the assessor makes a determination that the forfeiture of the deposit is fair. So similarly, in the same vein, the vendor or the person organizing the event was not permitted to automatically impose cancellation fees for events that could not proceed due to COVID-19. The exception, of course, is where the assessor determines that it's fair for all the parties in the circumstances of the case. Next, there were relief measures in relation to late payment interest and charges. So where there were late payment interest charges for arrears that arose due to COVID-19 during the period determined by the Minister for Law, what the Act did was to impose a cap on the charges that could be imposed on the parties. And for tenants who were unable to vacate their business premises, what the Act said was that instead of being liable for things like double rent, they would only be liable for an amount prescribed by the Minister for Law. The context of this is that during the period where businesses and offices were not allowed to resume or continue their businesses, they were also impacted because there were some tenants whose leases had ended and they were unable to vacate their premises. So unless the law intervened in such manner, they would continue incurring rental charges. So next, I turn to the rental relief framework, and this law is found in Part 2A of our Act. So this framework was introduced in Parliament later on the 5th of June. By June 2020, the COVID-19 situation was deteriorating globally, and even with the financial support measures that the government had provided, small and medium enterprises continued facing difficulties meeting their rental obligations. So there are certain statutory requirements that must be satisfied before the framework can apply. And what this framework helps to do is to ensure that there is an equitable co-sharing of rental obligations between the government, the landlords, and tenants. And all of these help to give businesses greater support and also give them more time to recover from the impact of COVID-19. Then there was Part 3 of the Act, which introduced temporary modifications to the existing laws on bankruptcy and insolvency. So for example, the laws were modified to increase the monetary threshold for both bankruptcy and insolvency. And the main objective of these temporary modifications was to give both businesses and individuals time and space to work things out instead of being thrust into insolvency and bankruptcy proceedings right at the outset. So these modifications lasted for 6 months and they are no longer in effect. So Part 4 relates to the conduct of meetings, and this was introduced in the climate where it was difficult to hold physical meetings, especially those involving a large number of attendees. So these sort of large-scale meetings were difficult to convene and are still difficult to convene in the current climate. What Part 4 helps to do is that it allows the Minister for Law to prescribe alternative arrangements for the holding of meetings. So these arrangements apply to meetings held, conducted, or deferred in the period starting 27th of March. So the measures allow meetings such as a company's annual general meeting to be held virtually. And there is also an option to hold a smaller gathering of attendees physically and having the rest of the meeting broadcast to the remaining attendees. Part 5 introduced measures on remote hearings. So the laws in Singapore already had measures that allowed for the use of remote technology in hearing cases. But what Part 5 of the Act helped to do was to facilitate the wider use of technology, so teleconference and virtual hearings to deal with cases. The laws that were introduced by the Act were complemented by circulars or guidelines introduced by the courts. And the main objective of these measures was to ensure that the doors to justice always remained open. Then there was Part 8. Part 8 of the Act provided relief to persons whose contracts were affected by construction delays. So by way of an illustration, there was a period of time when construction works had to stop entirely, and construction equipment and machinery such as bulldozers and tower cranes were left on construction sites unused. And contractors who had rented such expensive equipment and machinery were left with wasted rental costs. So what Part 8 helps to do is that it allows relief to be provided as long as the statutory requirements are satisfied. And if the case goes to the assessor may make adjustments to specific terms and obligations in contracts. So this is chiefly in relation to the rent that's due. Next, Part 10 of the Realign framework. So this was the latest set of measures to be introduced in the Act that is found in Part 10 of the Act. The framework was introduced on the 2nd of November last year, and it commenced on 15th January this year. The objective of this set of measures was to help businesses that were significantly impacted by COVID-19 to renegotiate their contracts with their counterparties. And we are talking about contracts that had been entered into before COVID-19. COVID-19 had not only fundamentally altered assumptions upon which these contracts were based, but also affected the viability of their businesses. So just like the other sets of measures, the Realign framework only applies where the statutory requirements are satisfied. So only certain categories of contracts are covered. Apart from that, businesses are only eligible for relief under this framework if they satisfy certain criteria relating to their financial circumstances. So the application for relief generally involves 3 steps. The first step involves eligible businesses submitting a notice of negotiation. So the window period for submitting these notices is closed. It ended on 26th February this year. Upon the service of this notice of negotiation, parties had 4 weeks to talk to each other and engage in negotiations. If the negotiations were successful, then the parties could proceed with the amended terms of their contracts, and if they wish to, they could terminate their own contracts. In the event that the negotiations were unsuccessful, then the contract could be terminated on just and fair outcomes which are prescribed in law under the Realign framework. And in the event of any disagreement between the parties, the dispute is determined by the assessors, again, not the courts, and these assessors are appointed by the Minister for Law. I now turn to the second and last part of this presentation, the Simplified Insolvency Program, or SIP for short. So the SIP was introduced on 29th January this year, and among other things, it was introduced because there were concerns of a potential increase in the numbers of financially distressed micro and small companies requiring assistance to restructure their debts or to rehabilitate their businesses or wind up their businesses which had ceased to be viable. So the SIP consists of 2 separate temporary and bespoke insolvency programs. We have the Simplified Debt Restructuring Program under Part 5A, and then we have the Simplified Winding Up Program under Part 10A. So the SIP's key features are that it is administered by the official receiver. It is open for applications by micro and small companies. The application period is for 6 months, and the application window can be open. The application window may be extended by the Minister for Law. There is once again certain statutory eligibility criteria to satisfy before the SIP can be made use of. So the law will look at things like the aggregate total liabilities of the company and the number of creditors and employees. Altogether, the features of the SIP are meant to provide for a simpler, faster and lower cost set of insolvency proceedings. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Rai, for this very complete and informative presentation. I will give the floor to Ms. Szymańska from Poland.
Yes, thank you for passing me the floor. Good afternoon. I'm happy for the possibility of attending this webinar and presenting the Polish experience of anti-crisis solutions. I also hope that this webinar and other future initiatives of this kind could be an effective international platform of best practice exchange, beneficiary and inspirational for all of the UNCITRAL members, as well as external stakeholders when it comes to the adoption of economic recovery legal measures. In reference to our contribution, we studied carefully the areas that were mentioned in the questionnaire, trying to relate it to the Polish anti-crisis solutions. And so far, from March 2020 until June 2021, Poland has adopted 9 anti-COVID laws, so-called shields. In our national legislation, we adopted measures focused on such sectors from the questionnaire as bankruptcy and insolvency, support for small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, public procurement, and corporate governance. When it comes to bankruptcy and insolvency issues, we introduced such solutions as the possibility for debtor who becomes insolvent in relation with the pandemic to delay filing for insolvency till the state of pandemic or risk of pandemic is lifted, the inclusion of insolvency proceedings into the catalog of urgent cases, and we simplified restructuring proceeding in a way that debtor may initiate the proceeding without the decision of the court. Referring to SMEs support measures, Poland adopted the possibility to hold the meetings of the management board and supervisory board of limited liability companies and joint stock companies with the use of modern technologies, teleconferencing and video conferencing, and facilitated the way of taking decisions via distance communication or written procedures. In this regard, we also introduced the possibility of exemptions or postponements from different types of taxes for a group of entrepreneurs whose beneficial liquidity has deteriorated due to COVID-19 negative economic consequences. We suspended the running of procedural and judicial deadlines, inter alia tax, customs, revenue controls, and it was enforced from March 21st last year to May 23rd. And additionally, for SME sector, we extended the scope of free legal aid to the matters related to conducted business activity. Furthermore, we guarantee in cases where the state of pandemic or risk of pandemic or the state of emergency apply, free legal aid and free civic counseling with the use of distance communication means and outside the offices of the entity. Moreover, for SME sector, from the end of the first quarter of 2020 until the end of 2020, our National Economy Bank could offer special conditions of the de minimis guarantee in the time of a pandemic situation related to the economic effects of the COVID-19. That means 0% commission, a guarantee of up to 80% of the loan amount, and standard one is 60%. The guarantee period of the working capital loan up to 39 months, comparable to the standard 27 months. The obligation for banks to hold additional capital under this systemic risk buffer has been abolished during the epidemic state. And in case of so-called bad debts, the debtors and also the creditors were exempted from the obligation to increase the tax base. not only when calculating tax advances, but also in the annual tax return submitted for the tax year in which the epidemic state was declared. We introduced a temporary exemption from excise duty of ethyl alcohol used in production of biocidal products and additional alcohol denaturant used for the production of such products were introduced. And this amendment created business opportunities for the chemical industry in the absence on the market of isopropyl alcohol used for the production of biocidal products. In addition, for SMEs, so-called small taxpayers of personal or corporate income tax, were able to opt out of simplified advances for the period of December last year, and calculate monthly tax advances on current income on general terms. They could pay lower advances, which could improve their liquidity. In relation to public procurement, we introduced the possibility of amending the public procurement contract and adapting the content of the legal relationship between the parties. So changes in socioeconomic conditions caused by COVID-19 were extended, and the contracting authority's liability for public finance discipline has been excluded. We lowered the permissible amount of the bid security in the case of contracts with a value above the EU threshold and performance bonds. And in case of corporate governance, the main solutions focused on postponement and extension of deadlines. When it comes to financial aid on national level, Poland adopted credit guarantees granted by our National Economy Bank, which could be offered up to the end of June this year. And finally, as EU member states, last year, we joined the Euro 25 billion European Guarantee Fund, and this year we ratified the Euro 750 billion European Recovery Fund, the establishment of which were directly related to the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Ms. Szymańska, and also for helping us with the time. Much appreciated. We now leave the European continent and we go to the Southern Hemisphere, and welcome Mr. Alcides Cardoso-Lix from the Ministry of Commerce of Angola. You have the floor, sir.
Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, for the floor. First of all, we would like to congratulate UNCITRAL for this work in order to share information on the measures taken by states to overcome the consequences of the global COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, disruption remains uncalculated without mentioning the large economic impact for all countries in the world. This presentation aims to show in summary the measures taken by our country, Angola, to prevent disease spread and also to reduce or mitigate the negative economic impact in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. In general, the government has adopted the GREAT program, a GREAT program, denominated Economic Alleviate Program, which is the base for alleviate negative impact of the pandemic on business in various areas such as bankruptcy and insolvency, support for small and medium-sized enterprises, public procurement, electronic commerce, despite the fact that here in Angola the preparation process for the legislation in this matter is ongoing. Business-to-business contractual relations, transportation and logistics, and corporate governance. This program was adopted by the government and is available on its website, namely http://governo.gov.au. Chair, let me bring some highlights about this program now. Saying that the purchase of agriculture and fisheries inputs and other consumers' goods of national origin, as well as the strengthening of the activity of cooperative in the productive sector, are being stimulated in a view to responding to the growing demand of and causing a reduction in the prices of basic products in the national market. For this purpose, project by 470 companies was approved in 2020 within the framework of economic relief measures and being implemented throughout the national territory. Of this member, 208 companies are number corresponding to the same number of projects are intended for the acquisition of consumer goods of national origin benefiting from the economic relief measures. We have also granted financing for around 754 projects. The economic relief measures also allowed for the approval of financing this number of microcredit projects whose financing line in managed by the Angolan Risk Capital Asset Fund, namely FACRA. With the projects approved, it is expected to generate around 54,241 jobs associated with agricultural activity, project management, entrepreneurs, among others, and an increase in the volume of business in company. We have in Angola, Angola Development Bank, and this is the bank who is charged to give this financing. Tax credit for the production of basic food basket products. Throughout 2020, various sectors of the economy benefit from 12 months tax credit measures on the value of VAT, in Portuguese, IVA, payable on the import of capital goods and raw materials that are used for the production of basic food basket goods. Our administration for tax here is charged of the collecting the credit from the companies. In fact, we have to recognize that the inspection of benefit companies is one of the highest constraints identified, since it requires an effective model to counteract the tendency of companies to apply financial resources in inappropriate programs. The solution found at the height of the current economic situation ways to set up the mechanism to alert companies whenever the reimbursement date approaches. The BDA, this Bank Development of Angola, the Credit Support Services team, the 18 provincial integrated economic development offices, and the 18 representatives of our institution for small, medium, and enterprises in all the province are involved in this process. Chair, moving forward on issue related to monitoring or compliance regime, for the purpose of monitoring the financing granted, there is a supervision or monitoring committee coordinated by Minister of Economy and Planning, integrating the ministerial department responsible for the production sector. Typically, companies linked to the trade sector did not report any obstacles related to the process of exports or to international markets. The Angola government has not adopted also any legislation that has an impact on transactional and border trade. There was, however, greater rigor in the transaction of certain goods in accordance with the decrees to update preventive measures. As for the issue of solution measures to mitigate commercial disputes within the COVID-19 pandemic in the country, through the sector's assessment, did not register any specific case. Finally, the health sector, through legal harmonization that urges for more simplified procedures for access and acquisition of drug linked to COVID-19. In this case, vaccines is to immunize the population. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luis, for your input and your report. We now move back to Europe, and I invite Mr. Niklaus Meyer from the Federal Office of Justice of Switzerland to present his report. Mr. Meyer, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Angelo, for this introduction, and many thanks to our Russian hosts for having organized this meeting, and also many thanks to the Russian Federation and Armenia and Vietnam for having initiated all this exchange of information. So this was a very interesting exercise for us, seeing what we have done in Switzerland, and also then comparing our Swiss response to other responses to the COVID pandemic. And of course, all national measures are somehow similar because they all have a similar goal, which is to give relief, both financial relief and also economic and legal support for economic actors. However, when going into the details, it was very quickly clear that in the details there are a lot of differences. And I just wanted to highlight this because even though we all have a similar goal in mind, our responses are very different in the details. And one reason for this is, for example, that we have different social security systems. And if you have a very strong social security system with huge unemployment benefits and also money given to economic actors for not firing their employees, even during an economic crisis, then of course there is much less need for immediate action in some legal areas, because the direct impact on individuals is less harmful. Of course, this is only in the short term. Then in the long term, you have other consequences such as higher taxes. I'm just saying this in order to make the point that we all have a similar goal, but our approaches are quite different. And of course, also if you are an export-oriented country with a lot of cross-border exchange, then your response will be much different than if you are a small island with less cross-border interaction. And my point is that we can have a lot of inspiration by analyzing the responses by others, but the specific measures will always be different from country to country. And this is also the reason why I believe this experience sharing what we're doing here now, it's very interesting, but we see more merit for UNCITRAL in continuing its work in general for cross-border commerce, because we believe that both their substantive and procedural work helps the economy in general, and therefore also for pandemic relief. But we do not necessarily see one possibility for really having pandemic-specific solutions on a global level. But this is certainly a point to discuss later. Now to the Swiss COVID-19 response. First, some caveats. I can only comment on what we have done on the federal level, and well, Switzerland is like a small European Union with different member states, so different cantons, and the competence for some measures, for example, most sanitary measures, vaccination campaigns, and this kind of very important pandemic response. This is not necessarily handled on the federal level, but rather on the lower level, on the cantonal level. So I cannot comment on this, but of course it's an important impact of any pandemic strategy. And I will limit my remarks to the measures that are interesting in the UNCITRAL context. So I will not talk about entry control at the borders. I will just address some legal measures. And in this area, in the legal area, I can say that we have basically three types of measures, and they can be summarized by, well, giving money, giving time, and giving digital possibilities. So first, giving money. Well, I guess all states had a similar approach in this regard, that well, economic actors needed money. So we have enabled a system of easy access to credits for corporations and economic actors, and they were able to go to their normal banks and get money, and then this was guaranteed by the state, by the Swiss Confederation, so that they were able to get money. And also the access to unemployment benefits was made easier. So this is the first aspect, giving money. And then the second aspect is giving time. So this means, for example, extending deadlines for authorizations, and also giving a little bit more time for payments, or having longer judicial holidays, so to enable the actors to wait and see where they can file their action. But I must say that in this regard, we only granted in general perhaps a few weeks more than usual, because every time that you give a debtor more time, then you have a creditor that gets a problem. And in order to prevent these kind of chain reactions, I would say that our intervention was very limited. So we had some interventions where we granted more time, but this is quite limited. For example, for companies, they were not required to announce to the court their liquidity problems. Usually they would have to do so and then trigger insolvency proceedings, and there we had some more delays granted, but this is really very limited. And then the third set of measures, it's well, giving digital possibilities, and this was in order to enable our authorities, our legal systems, and also the society in general to keep working. Some measures, for example, are that we allowed all corporations to have their meetings online, even though their own internal rules would not provide for this. But they were all allowed to have their meetings online, and also in legal proceedings, more and more video conferencing was used. To some here, this may seem like a small step, but at least for Switzerland, this was a giant leap. perhaps others working in government all have this problem that we cannot use Zoom on our government equipment, and you can assume that this is also the same for courts. So we are still facing some kind of technical issues, but I can say that this pandemic, it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. So it definitely helped us shifting some priorities, because it forced us to adopt new measures or to implement measures that some already wanted to implement earlier on, but we never had the impetus to do it. So I definitely believe this was an opportunity. And we also realized that all the international organizations active in the field of cross-border commerce, such as UNCITRAL, or also the sister organizations, A-Conference and UNITRAL, they all have tremendous instruments that can help us addressing the cross-border challenges that we are facing now. The thing is just you have to implement them, and this takes time. So our conclusion is also that, well, we have to see what instruments are there around and then implement them, because it's better done with time and not under stress as we had it during this pandemic. So thank you very much for UNCITRAL for your excellent preparation of all these instruments on cross-border commerce, because they really helped us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niklaus. Thank you also for the advertisement for UNCITRAL. It's always appreciated. I may also thank you for your taxonomy. I like this breakdown of giving money, giving time, and encouraging digitization of processes. I hope I have your authorization for to piggyback on that later on in my concluding remarks. So with that, I would now invite our next speaker, and that is Mr. Pavel Kelingaryan from the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Honorable Moderator, for the ability to present the measures taken by the Russian Federation to cope with the COVID-19. I would also like to thank all the participating parties to this webinar. So the Russian Parliament passed 2 laws on measures during the pandemic situation. The first one in April of 2020 and the second one in the June of the same year. And the government of the Russian Federation passed more than 20 orders implementing provisions of such laws. The response measures that the government of Russia has adopted to address obstacles faced by businesses were in the following areas. The first area is bankruptcy and insolvency. The bankruptcy freeze for certain legal entities and individuals was applied to companies and individual entrepreneurs doing businesses in the industries the most affected by the pandemic, and also to the strategic and systemic organizations. Systemic meaning the most important entities for the economy. The measure was in effect starting from the 4th of April of 2020 and could be voluntarily waived by the debtors if they wished to do so. The moratorium rules were also applied to pending bankruptcies, and enforcement of adjudged property claims arising prior to the moratorium was suspended until the moratorium had been lifted. A simplified free debt settlement procedure was also established for people who were in a challenging financial situation, based on a digital platform and with no court proceedings, which helps to make this process a lot easier. The moratorium has spread for over more than 500,000 organizations, which constitutes 14.2% of all legal entities in the Russian Federation, and more than 1.6 million sole proprietorships, which constitutes 40.3% of all Russian proprietors. All these measures have resulted in 20 and 8% reduction of bankruptcy cases in Russia in 2020 accordingly, in comparison with 2019. Also, an important field of support was support for small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. SMEs had got the possibility of deferring payments due for property leased by the state. SMEs were able to conclude additional agreements, providing the condition on deferring mandatory payments. State-owned enterprises and institutions were also able to conclude additional agreements with the SMEs on deferred rental payments. The conditions were being based on the agreement of the parties, and there have been over 20,000 above-mentioned additional agreements concluded by these SMEs that covered over 53,000 real estate properties. The overall sum of rent payments suspended surpasses 30 billion rubles, or 133 million euros estimated. Social insurance contributions rate on employee compensations in excess of the above minimum wage was established as low as 15%, as opposed to the previous 30%. Also, SMEs operating in various hit industries were being granted tax benefits. Businesses from COVID-19 affected economy sectors could claim interest-free loans to finance salary payments. And interest-free loans was granted for 6 months and could be extended for another 6 months at the rate of 4%. Also, state-owned microfinance organizations have received 20 billion rubles, or about 132 million euros in allocation towards reduced state microloans. And the measure was expected to improve the accessibility of soft loans during the COVID-19 outspread and would help to preserve up to 150,000 jobs. Finally, as we have already mentioned, tenants of federal and municipal property were being entitled to rent renewal. In the field of public procurement, suppliers were entitled to invoke force majeure to avoid liability and alter the contract terms. Concerning the electronic commerce, only remote audits were permitted, including via audio or video conferencing, and site visits were allowed only in exceptional cases. Concerning tax control measures, they were carried out in line with the decisions of the region based on the sanitary situation in the region itself. Obligatory pre-installation of Russian software was postponed from the 1st of July 2020 to the 1st of January of 2021. In the field of business-to-business contractual relations, we should go to the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, which stated that the spread of coronavirus infection cannot be acknowledged as a force majeure for all categories of debtors. Therefore, force majeure circumstances must be declared with regard to the circumstances of each particular case, based on the obligation, performance deadline, nature of the defaulted obligation, reasonable care and good faith of the debtor, and etc. It should be noted that under the general rule, a non-availability of sufficient fund does not receive the debtor from liability for failure to perform an obligation. However, if such non-availability resulted from the imposed restrictions, including suspension of certain types of activities, self-isolation or other, the liability for failure to perform an obligation may be lifted under the Article 401 of the Civil Code of Russian Federation. Free certificates also are being issued by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry starting from the 26th of March 2020, and they not certify the COVID-19 outbreak per se, but the restrictions and other response measures taken by the authorities to curb the spread of the coronavirus, causing Russian companies to fail to fulfill their contractual obligations. And as already mentioned, landlords were obliged to grant rent relief to tenants from distressed industries upon tenants' request. In the field of corporate governance, deadlines of corporate procedures were also being extended. So there were the following changes. The deadline for holding an annual general meeting of shareholders was extended until the 30th of September 2020, as opposed to prior the 30th of June 2020. Also, the government was authorized to approve annual reports of certain state-owned companies to leave the burden of the companies itself. And if a company net assets value went below its charter capital in 2020, it would not trigger liquidation, which saved a lot of companies, as we suppose. General shareholders meetings also could be held online without determining their particular venue, which also helped with the sanitary situation. And to list several other measures, we should mention, of course, that the government approved the procedure for state registration of certain medical supplies that are intended for use during emergencies or for prevention and treatment of dangerous diseases. The list of these supplies included lung ventilators, oxygenators, insulating and operating gowns, masks, thermometers, and other things overall 363 items. The government also has adopted the temporary procedure for certification of products originating from epidemically unsafe countries. And for products which with certificate expiration dates between May and December of 2020, and for new products that had insignificant differences in design, formulation, manufacturing technology, new certificates were being issued. Products certified under the above-mentioned rules had to be inspected before the 1st of July 2021. Sampling, manufacturing facilities analysis, and management system evaluation also could be conducted remotely to prevent the spread of the virus. Speaking about the agricultural producers who had signed agreements on enhancing competitiveness, they were considered eligible for soft loans, even if they had failed to achieve their 2020 export targets, which a lot did, of course. Soft loans at a reduced rate for investment purposes up to 15 years and short-term loans up to 1 year could also be claimed by companies from fishing, fish breeding, and timber processing sectors. The government also approved a list of industries that were most affected by the deteriorating situation and the spread of a new coronavirus infection to provide them with priority targeted support. And this support also included the following measures. 6 months deferral for payment of all taxes, excluding VAT, and 6 month deferral for payment of insurance premiums to state extra budgetary funds for micro enterprises. 6 month deferral for loans for small and medium-sized enterprises, additional measures to ensure sustainable lending to the real sector, including state guarantees and subsidies, 6 month moratorium on filing credit applications for corporate bankruptcies and recovery of debts and fines from enterprises, and deferral for rental payments, and expanding the SME's ability to obtain loans at a reduced rate, not more than 8.5%. And moratorium on state authorities, test purchases, and scheduled and unscheduled inspections. So having said that, I want to thank you very much for giving me the floor, and again to thank all the members of today's webinar, and pass the floor to our honorable moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for also following the example of our colleagues and being such a brilliant keeper of your time. I now give the floor to the next government representative, and Ms. Elena Simonian. So we're now moving from Moscow to Yerevan.
Hello, everyone. I am Elena Simonian from the Ministry of Economy. I'm an advisor. So I would like to represent Armenia's measures throughout the outbreak of coronavirus. As we all know, the outbreak of the virus in the world economy has caused an emergency situation and decrease of global economic growth, as existing restrictions were hurting key areas, key industries such as the export industry, agriculture, tourism, the hotel industry, and etc. Due to the crisis, organizations have faced a number of problems, including restrictions on employees' workplaces, supply chain disruptions, declining demand due to the changes in consumer behavior and government-imposed restrictions, and so on. So with the regard of the questionnaire, let me go through the questions one by one. With the regard of the first question, it's worth mentioning about the adoption of the law on making amendments on the law of bankruptcy by National Assembly, and the Ministry of Justice took part in the revision of the law. Later, the government adopted decree on defining the cases and procedure for creditors to participate in the voting for the financial recovery plan under the requirements arising from the cash liabilities to the state budget of the Republic of Armenia. The Ministry of Justice has developed the draft law on making amendments and supplements to the Civil Code of the Republic of Armenia and related laws, which is currently in the stage of revision. Considering the importance of SME sector development in Armenia's economy and its potential government policies to support SME development have recently greatly improved in Armenia, which is evidenced by the adoption of the government decree in August last year, approving the SME Development Strategy for 2020 to 2024. The strategy aims to increase SME competitiveness by implementing reforms in key areas such as the regulatory framework, access to resources, including finance, human capital development, market access, and so on. The strategy clearly defines the SME development policy, framework, goals, expected results, and activities. It has been developed based on the comprehensive analysis of the current economic situation in the country, business and institutional environment, as well as OECD SBA assessment results. The strategy also addresses the challenges caused by the spread of coronavirus on SME sector and provides the approaches on its possible mitigation. The government of Armenia showed, this is with regards of the second question, the government of Armenia showed its quick response to COVID-19 throughout April 2020, following the declaration of state emergency. The Ministry of Economy, in collaboration with Business Support Center and Investment Support Center, conducted a series of online webinars intended for businesses operating in the country. They were aimed in helping entrepreneurs in overcoming challenges they were facing because of the imposed lockdown, and so more than 20 webinars were held with the participation of 3,000 entrepreneurs covering various topics. And then it was accompanied by a survey, and according to the survey, businesses were required consulting in many different areas. For example, the financial management, human resources, legal and other taxation, and so on. Based on the reviews, comments and recommendations made by the participants, a new coaching project called Business Against COVID-19 was launched by the Ministry of Economy. The latter was an online consulting led by top specialists on more than 100 different topics, covering more than 1,000 hours of personalized coaching. So the government of Armenia has designed and launched more than 25 social and economic mitigation programs. The main objective of the economic programs was to mitigate the liquidity risks companies were facing due to COVID-19 outbreak and to create the possibility of temporary access to financial resources. The programs have mainly sector-specific targets, supporting mainly those sectors which were mostly affected, such as tourism, accommodation and food services, transport, SMEs, agriculture, construction, and so on. Financing was provided not only to cover the operational costs and keep employees, but also encouraged investments and acquisition of new equipment, materials to ensure continuation of their operations. So let me introduce some of the measures. For example, government measure number 1, till now, provides loans with preferential conditions to companies. The means of assistance includes co-financing, refinancing, and subsidizing of the businesses with a good credit and tax history. Second and 24 programs are designed specifically for companies in the sphere of agriculture. The third program has been designed specifically to assist SMEs to continue and rearrange their activities. The means of assistance included soft loans, depending on the turnover amount to maximum 50 million Armenian drams, which is around 90,000 euros. So more than 800 companies benefited and were able to receive loans and continue their operations. Government measure number 10 provides small grants to micro businesses. The 19th program was specifically designed and launched for startups, supporting startups and innovations. And eligible applicants who successfully completed business training courses may receive the credit guarantees to receive credits from commercial banks on preferential conditions. So the other programs were 5, 18, 21, which provided small grants, and the objective of the programs was to support the maintenance of effective jobs, and the form of assistance was a lump sum grant. And the objective of 17 program was to encourage the implementation and commercialization of innovative ideas in the industry, and the objective of 23rd program is to support individual tourism businesses in Armenia. The program 25 provides grants to transportation sector companies, which are in the tourism sector. In addition to government support programs, the Ministry of Economy, in cooperation with Investment Support Center, has developed an information platform for business support. The purpose of the platform is to raise awareness of local and international business support programs, courses, grants, and educational activities, as well as to intensify participation in these areas. Business Support Center, with collaboration with Ministry, developed the Business Continuity Planning COVID-19 in Armenia guideline that provides companies with precise recommendations and information to be followed, and the steps to be undertaken in the face of the economic downturn. With regard to point B in the fifth question, I would like to mention that on September 4, National Assembly last year adopted the laws on making amendments and supplements on the law on protection of the population in emergency situation and on ensuring sanitary and epidemiological safety of the population of the Republic of Armenia. With regard to sixth question, last year, at the 24th of March and 26th of October, the Supreme Judicial Council adopted decision on the measures ensuring execution of the decision in the commandment number 15, which is on the restrictions being applied for implementation of public service in the whole territory of Republic of Armenia, and on the measures being implemented for prevention of the spread of coronavirus pandemic. So this is briefly introduced to what Armenia has done during the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will then be moving to the next circle of speakers, so to speak, that are representative of international organizations. But as I mentioned before, I wanted to piggyback on what the term that Nicholas Meyer has used, giving money, giving time, and facilitating trade by allowing digitization of processes. On the giving money aspect, it reminds me of all the amount of money that is involved in this measure. Perhaps one day we'll then resurrect an idea a few years ago that was launched at UNCITRAL, that UNCITRAL should work on sovereign debt restructuring, because this is the one aspect one has not talked about, as the collective debt has been accumulated by this measure. But this, of course, is just a joke. We're not going to work on that area. But now moving to the next round of speakers, we have Martin Roy from the World Trade Organization, and Raoul Renard from the ICC. The World Trade Organization being a public sector, the Raoul Renard represents the private sector, and Martin Roy would share with us his experience on the measures that have been notified to the WTO because of the trade impact of measures adopted in response to the COVID pandemic. Martin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you to organizers for inviting me, allowing me to take part in this, and salutations to Secretary Joubin-Bret. Indeed, it has been a long time, and I guess it's a sign of the times that the reunion is happening on Zoom. What I want to talk about indeed is the trade response to the crisis. So I will talk about measures adopted by governments that affect trade, but I will also say a few words about the pandemic's impact on trade, so as to put into context a bit the kind of response that took place. So I will briefly focus on goods trade and also talk about services trade, because the type of impact and also the type of response of governments have been quite different in the two areas. So starting with merchandise trade or goods trade, global trade, as you know, was very strongly affected by the pandemic. There was a drop in about 8% by our estimates for 2020. But if we put that in a broader context, I think that a key aspect is that trade has been surprisingly resilient during 2020. So if we compare with, for example, the great financial crisis, it has been relatively resilient. There was a large drop in the first half of the year, and then a fairly strong rebound from the third quarter as the health situation started to improve. Trade in medical goods was proved very strong. Trade in agricultural products was relatively steady compared to the previous year. Trade in GV or global value chain related products also have been resilient, despite, of course, all the difficulties and the challenges faced with, closed borders and quarantines and so on. So this general resilience, despite the economic shock, is also because of the trade response of governments. And cooperation on trade by governments has proved very important in limiting the damage on trade and the economic damage. So overall, trade has been a force for good because it enabled access to medical supply. Trade in medical products actually increased during the pandemic last year by 16%. Trade in personal protective equipment increased by 50%. And the multilateral trading system, the WTO, helped to provide some transparency, exchange of information on various measures taken by governments during this crisis. So it is important also to say that this restraint in terms of the response of government more broadly has prevented a more negative or destructive even scenario of accelerating protectionist measures and tit for tat that could have further hurt the world economy in the context of a very, very strong negative economic shock. Overall, if we look at the specific measures that governments have taken and their response, we see that the response has been more trade facilitating than trade restrictive overall. So for example, if we look at G20 economies since the outbreak, we have seen 140 trade-related measures in response affecting trade in goods. More than 70% were trade facilitating, so lowering of tariffs and barriers on some medical products, for example, and a bit less than 30% were trade restrictive, mostly in the form of export restrictions or export bans. So a number of these measures remain in place. A good amount have been withdrawn. We see that if we look at in terms of the number of measures, most of the measures that have been withdrawn are trade facilitating. If we look at the trade coverage of measures put in place during the crisis and that remain, we see that in terms of trade coverage, the trade restrictive measures are slightly more important to this day. So there's still cooperation to take place to come back to a situation where these restrictive measures on trade can be withdrawn. For services trade, that's an important area because the impact and also the response is quite different. And also it has implications for maybe what will follow in the coming years. Services trade was the sector or the area that was the most strongly impacted by the crisis. And of course, that's because of the types of measures that governments have taken, lockdowns, restrictions at the border, restricting the mobility of natural persons supplying services, limiting the movement of consumers. So the impact on services sectors and services trade was quite strong. And we see that by commercial services exports dropping by 20% in 2020 compared to the previous year. And of course, in the first half of the year, the drop was even steepest, around 30%. Now, with services, the other key aspect is that the response has varied a lot across different sectors. So we see that tourism, there's been obviously a very strong decline. That's in a very important economic area and trade area for many countries. Transport was down 20%. Tourism or travel was down more than 60% in terms of trade. But at the same time, in other sectors, there has been a few changes and a few positive impact. It has clearly led to a greater focus on online supply in many sectors, from retail, health, education, business services, online supply cross-border, but also domestically, of course. Suppliers of services have accelerated their efforts to expand their online operations. Consumers have adopted new habits that have contributed to a very significant change and probably a long-term shift towards online services. So the crisis in this way has further accelerated this shift towards digital economy, digital services, and e-commerce more generally. Now, if we look at the types of responses or measures that governments have taken that affect trade and services, we have compiled over 120 measures taken by governments affecting trade and services. And what we see is these measures tend to be more facilitating even than for trade in goods. So we have seen, for example, some governments eliminating restrictions that they had to some telecommunication services, such as voice over IP services, cross-border trade. We have seen different types of measures of governments that have affected trade and services in different ways, measures to ensure that more telecom capacity was made available to operators, for example, measures to facilitate access of the population to telecommunication services. So that affects trade and investment in the sector, more lenient requirements on financial services suppliers, measures to reduce and slash barriers to online payments, and all types of measures to facilitate the online supply of services. In addition to these types of measures, there were a few areas where there were trade restrictive measures imposed, but these related mostly to foreign investment regimes. We also see the crisis further emphasizing the importance of adaptation in legal frameworks to ensure a better treatment of electronic transactions, online consumer protection, adaptations to ensure e-signatures, and basically to facilitate the way businesses operate in the online environment. So to conclude, looking forward, I think that services and online services and e-commerce will remain important also in the response of governments in the recovery. A greater openness, predictability that trade rules and trade commitments that are legally binding can provide are very important for trade and investment in telecommunication, ICT services, and all the different types of services that can be supplied online. And this will be a very important aspect to also facilitate and encourage further the economic recovery in the months and years to come. So thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now I invite Raoul Renard from the ICC to address us. Raoul, please.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Secretary, Honourable Chair, ladies and gentlemen. The International Chamber of Commerce would like to extend our thanks to UNCITRAL, to the Russian Federation, and to the International and Comparative Law Research Center for this opportunity to engage on a very important topic. I must say, Madam Secretary, that it's an honour to be referred by you as a fellow partner in crime with UNCITRAL. Many of the measures taken by member states that are captured in their responses have been decisive in keeping businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, afloat throughout the pandemic. Bankruptcy and insolvency measures, for instance, were essential as lockdown measures caused severe cash flow disruptions. Ms. Ray's intervention, in particular on behalf of Singapore, pointed to the importance of targeted relief for parties that were unable to perform contractual duties due to the pandemic. It strikes me that this exercise, and indeed the pandemic, was a unique opportunity to trial a wide array of policy options and measures, most temporary, but some with the potential to be longer term, that can inform UNCITRAL's work. For instance, which policy initiatives for enhancing access to credit for MSMEs during the pandemic may have resonance for the future instrument under development by UNCITRAL's Working Group 1. This survey provides an opportunity to harvest various options for future discussion. One quick observation, several state responses appear to fall outside of the mandate of UNCITRAL. I'm referring here to calls for a harmonized legal system through which states could access pharmaceutical products and vaccines, coordinated global implementation of vaccines, long and short-term approaches to the liberalization of goods in the health sector, and proposals of this kind. These issues are obviously of critical importance, both to ending the pandemic and to enabling the economic recovery. But they are being addressed in other fora, including the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization. Of note, several WTO members have advanced the Trade and Health Initiative, launched by the Ottawa Group of WTO members. The Trade and Health Initiative has been presented to the General Council of the WTO for discussion. The initiative outlines specific actions relating to export restrictions, trade facilitation, technical regulations, tariffs, and transparency, as well as review exercises that reflect emerging best practice. It's ICC's view that these actions should be adopted by the broader membership and inform a consensus statement to establish new WTO commitments on trade and health at the 12th Ministerial Conference later this year. Chair, in many parts of our economies, digital transformation has occurred at a staggering pace in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But unfortunately, we haven't seen comparable digitization in international merchandise trade. By way of example, US e-commerce user growth, saw user growth of around 40% last year as a result of the social distancing and lockdown measures. Regarding the incredible growth in the digital economy over the last 25 years, in particular in the last 2 years, one cannot avoid acknowledging that UNCITRAL texts have been essential enablers of this growth. I'm thinking obviously about the landmark model law on electronic commerce, but also the model law on electronic signatures, the UN Convention on the electronic communications in international contracts. Turning again then to international merchandise trade, a startling figure focuses our attention. The Digital Container Shipping Association found at the end of 2020 that despite the pandemic, last year only 0.1% of bills of lading were issued electronically. Antiquated legal frameworks too often hold back adoption of digital trade solutions, forcing a reliance on cumbersome and costly paper-based processes. In this respect, global trade seems to be one area of the economy immune to the rapid digitization affected by the pandemic. I cannot put it better than the G7 digital and technology ministers when they said in late April, paper-based transactions, which still dominate international trade, are a source of cost, delay, inefficiency, fraud, error, and environmental impact. It is our shared view that by enabling businesses to use electronic transferable records, we will generate efficiencies and economic savings. End quote. Now, Chair, as you well know, UNCITRAL's Working Group 4 has already come up with an elegant, carefully considered and practical way forward for trade digitization, and that is the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records. The MLETR provides an enabling legal environment for the transition to paperless trade. Adopting the MLETR carries with it the prospect of faster, cheaper, more secure international trade transactions that are less prone to fraud and that have a lighter environmental impact and that can help power the post-COVID economic recovery. Perhaps then, if I may humbly submit, the most impactful step that states can take in their economic recovery, especially with respect to merchandise trade and digitization, is to adopt UNCITRAL texts and in particular the MLETR. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Raul, and especially for being such a a powerful advocate of the implementation of UNCITRAL standards in the era of electronic commerce. You speak straight to my heart, as I was for a long time Secretary of the Working Group 4 on Electronic Commerce at UNCITRAL. We'll get back to these points in the discussion. This concludes now the round of presentations, and I would now like to open the floor for questions. I understand that questions are being asked in the second room, the attendance rooms, and then they'll be connected over here to us by the platform moderators. So do we have any questions so far? You please raise your hands if you want to ask questions. Use the raise hands device. I already have one in this room, if I may. Madame Joubin-Bret, please.
Thank you very much, Angelo, and I hope this will also break the ice for other questions to come. I would like to ask Martin Roy whether these measures that have been compiled and analyzed by the WTO and that are being reported, I understand, on an annual basis to the G20, if this compilation is available, and if possibly we could use it as an additional document for the Commission session when the discussion comes on what is falls within UNCITRAL's mandate and what is otherwise compiled and monitored by other international organizations. Thank you.
Martin, please.
Yeah, I think I would have to verify. Certainly, we're happy to share information. We will be issuing in the coming week or two our report on G20 economies, so providing the overall assessment and counting of measures implemented so far, and we will issue later in July for all WTO members the same numbers. So I'm sure we can share some of that information. We issued similar reports which can already be shared. I think they are publicly available, that were published last November for year 2020. And of course, most of the measures taken in response to the pandemic were actually implemented last year. Of course, since then, a few have been withdrawn, but most of these measures were taken in 2020. But we certainly can stay in touch to see what we can best share with you.
Thank you, Martin. To the attendants in room 2, you under the reactions icon down on the menu line, bar, you can use the raise your hand function for asking questions. But if there is no question coming from room, no. Okay, if there is no question now, yeah, thank you. I would ask, I use my privilege as a moderator to ask also questions to the speakers. And may I begin asking Mr. Chilingarian one question. I found an interesting reference in the Russian replies to the report about the fact, first of all, this general statement by the Russian Supreme Court that COVID-19 as such is not generally a force majeure that would generally have the effect of justifying non-performance of contracts, but that countries that are affected by particular measures can invoke that concretely, and that the Chamber of Commerce certifies the existence of measures for that purpose. And if you could perhaps explain to us how exactly this process of certification by the Chamber of Commerce, is this meant for domestic use or for international transactions?
Thank you very much for your question, honorable moderator. The system that works in our country is that our Supreme Court stated that not in every case the coronavirus infection works as a force majeure for all categories of debtors and contracts. However, when the Chamber of Commerce and Industry issues its certificate, these certificates are the evidence of the fact that there is, in fact, some problems in the execution of the contract between the parties, which are usually the parties from different states, which may apply for some kind of interstate arbitration. And in that case, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry poses as the body who can give a certificate as an evidence of the fact that there are, in fact, some problems in the execution of the contract due to some restrictions and obstacles created by the COVID-19 situation. First of all, these are the closed borders, or many restrictions on the trade and entering and going out of the countries, and the quarantines, of course. And I would also like to pass the floor to the Director of the Legal Department of the Ministry of Economic Development, Mr. Gershanok, to further answer your question.
Thank you very much for questions, and I will speak to Russian. And
this question was raised when the COVID obstacles emerged, and the Russian Supreme Court does not acknowledge the pandemic as the force majeure situation. And in the beginning, when we had this situation, yes, in the legislation, there was no norm which could directly speak about the way how we acknowledge the force majeure situations and obstacles. And now we are making amendments to the legislation on the trade chambers by the Ministry of Economic Development. We prepare the relative draft laws which regulate how these obstacles should be acknowledged as force majeure by the trade chambers. The trade chamber in 2020 accumulated huge experience of issuing such certificates, and the entrepreneurs and legal entities could apply, and based on specific situation, the trade chamber would issue such certificates. We accumulated enough experience in this area, and today, after summarizing it, we are making amendments to the national legislation. The government of the Russian Federation ordered us to prepare the draft laws, relevant corresponding draft laws, and we give authorities to trade chambers to issue such certificates. And at the same time, such certificates, which are a conclusion, can be given by the regional trade chambers as well, who issue them under the control of the Central Trade Chamber of the Russian Federation. We hope that during the autumn session, this law will be adopted by the State Duma, and the Trade Chamber, using this law, will be able to issue such certificates irrespective of the conditions when these obstacles and situations of force majeure emerge. And now in the legislation, we have only the force majeure for international intergovernmental contracts, and with the help of this initiative, we will address the national activities, business activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that actually then leads me naturally to the second question that I would like to ask, and this is to Ms. Rai from Singapore. Is the approach taken in Singapore is different? I mean, from my understanding from the legislations, that you have for certain specially affected sectors already created a sort of presumption of frustration or force majeure, which of course has to be then demonstrated in a concrete case. But there are some certain sectors in which a party that is affected can invoke that. And my question is this envisaged to be only applicable within the context of this particular pandemic, or is there any thought given of making this mechanism also available for similar situations in the future?
Okay, so the Act is specific to the COVID-19 pandemic, hence its title. It's also got a sunset clause, which means that the temporary measures are going to cease after a certain period of time. So it is something that was specifically and specially designed to deal with this particular pandemic. It's not something that we can use for touch wood, something that happens in future. If something happens in future, we'll have to think about it then. The law doesn't introduce a presumption. The contracts that are listed in the first schedule are a legislative recognition of the sectors which were impacted by COVID-19. But there is still a necessity, there is a need to show that the inability, for example, to perform a contractual obligation was due to COVID-19, and that the inability was not caused by any other factor. And that is something that the assessors, when they're looking or determining the dispute, that's something that they look at. So it's not something that applies automatically as a presumption. It is something for the party seeking relief to show.
Okay. Okay. So then that party then bears the full burden of proof of its inability to perform due to COVID, if I understand it correctly, right?
Yes. So some cases are very clear cut. So the travel restrictions made travel almost impossible. So in March last year, for example, so it was a very clear-cut case of COVID-19 having affected that contract materially. We also had situations where contracts involving large gatherings, like 1,000 guests. So those events could not proceed, and it was very clear that it was connected to COVID-19 and the measures that the government had introduced to stem the spread of COVID. So there were some very clear cases and some cases where the party seeking relief had to demonstrate that it was indeed affected by COVID-19.
Right. Thank you. And if I understood the Russian system correctly, this certificate already helps substantiate the case, the certificate issued by the Chamber of Commerce in the Russian case. We still have no questions on room 2? Okay. May I ask Ms. Szymańska to I saw among the measures that you mentioned, and some of the measures that were approved in Poland, for instance, the possibility of I think it was only related to tax breaks for returning goods that became unusable due to pandemic. I think there was even an express reference to beer that could not be consumed during pandemic. Are there other sectors or other types of commodities or goods that have received a similar treatment, or is there any consideration being given to that?
Oh, just drinking beer was allowed all the time, and wine and other just things. So it was only connected with a special kind of alcohol that was used for producing this equipment necessary for our protection, as we don't have the facilities in Poland that produce such things. So we had to think and to have some remedies that we could use at hand. So don't worry, now you can travel also to Poland, and we can meet outside in the restaurants, in the garden, or inside also, and drink everything as you can imagine.
Okay, thank you very much. So if you don't have questions, then in room 2, and since already then one minute past the time, perhaps then we could, and I don't know whether any of the speakers would like to ask any of the other speakers a question. If that is not the case, then we're going to move then to our concluding remarks. And we must say that we've ourselves found the work of compiling this information, structuring and presenting it, quite an interesting and fascinating one. On the one hand, we are confronted with a certain number of measures that are far from our mandate, as Raul was pointing out, and also as also surmises from what Martin said and most of the speakers said, especially the measures on economic support and providing tax breaks and giving money, as Nicholas was saying. Some of the measures of the giving time are more related to administrative procedures, but then many of them get into private and commercial law aspects. For instance, a moratoria on insolvency and a moratoria on personal bankruptcy, or also on enforcement of guarantees. And others get more closely related to our mandate at UNCITRAL. They include common standards in electronic service of documents, legal assistance to SMEs, accelerated digital transformation, and facilitated business registration and other aspects. Many of these relate to instruments that UNCITRAL has already adopted. We heard from Raul, and I thank you again for this forceful statement in favor of implementation of existing standards. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. And as also Martin was saying, there's the opportunity that was generated by this crisis of paying more attention to the needs to facilitate trade by adopting digital standards, but also other existing standards as the ones that we are currently formulating on MSME insolvency and the simplified business structure for MSMEs that UNCITRAL is currently developing may also play a role in the recovery phase of the crisis. I would like to also mention one point that Raul made that I found also significant. This reference to the fact that we still are running a trade and transportation system based on paper documents. It's been more than 20 years, nearly 30 years, that one started talking about electronic bills of lading. And already the very first edition of the UNCITRAL model law on electronic commerce had a provision to enable electronic bills of lading. The 2009 Rotterdam Rules, the Convention on the International Carriage of Goods Transported wholly or partly by sea, has extensive provisions on how to affect the migration from a paper bill of lading to electronic bill of lading. And so that's why we were very pleased to see in the G7 statement such a statement in favor of the implementation of the model law on electronic transfer records. And perhaps also that would give another boost for looking also in particular to the maritime sector. Also the need for modernization of the existing legal regime there, and what can be found in the Rotterdam Rules for that purpose. But also like to mention one other aspect, and it is a project that is not yet before a working group at UNCITRAL, but is in the process of moving towards there. And that is a proposal that China made 2 years ago to develop negotiable multimodal transport documents, independently of the individual liability regimes for carriage of goods. Of course, that instrument would, by its nature, have to be also electronic, and would have the impact of providing also MSMEs with a collateral that they can use for trade financing. And if that is issued electronic, would also help to boost electronic trade. So I think one of the big takeaways from this discussion is that how much can already be achieved by the implementation of existing standards. But I think another important takeaway would be, in my view, that these information sharing and the sharing of best practice can also have immense value for countries. I mean, take the example of how to deal with contract law and force majeure under your system, but also within the context of international agreements such as the UN Convention on Contract for the International Sale of Goods, the CISG. Right. So, and then I think we're very pleased that the Russian Federation addressed this request to us to compile this information. And we see that by the responses that there is a high level of spontaneous harmonization of countries reacting in a similar way or coming up with a similar catalog of measures. Of course, many of them have to be tailored to their specific context. But we also see that there are areas where one would have to be, in the light of our experience with pandemic, be looking into our current instruments and future instruments to make sure that they will be withstanding the challenges of any similar situation also for the future. Those would be my remarks on by way of conclusion, and I would now to invite Mr. Gershanok from the Russian, from the legal department of the Russian Ministry of Economic Development to make his own concluding remarks before I close the webinar. Mr. Gershanok, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are very satisfied by today's discussion, and we agree that in general, the measures which are adopted by our countries are similar, but still we have certain differences, and we should adopt the mechanisms in the context of our countries to counteract against the current challenges. We heard lots of exciting and interesting examples, and we are going to analyze that so that we could use that in national legislation. In particular, we heard a very interesting proposal on the opportunity to have the assessors to acknowledge the force majeure obstacles and situations, and from other side, we are ready to offer the mechanisms and the practices that we have in the Russian Federation. This is very important for the businesses to have specific legal mechanisms to fight against these situations which emerge, and also trans-border businesses should be void from obstacles in solving the problems which are related to some force majeure unprecedented situations. I'm convinced that we should move towards a unification, harmonization of our legislations and towards creation of favorable conditions for the businesses so that we can address those problems and solve them. I am confident that today's discussion is not the last one, and we are ready to actively participate in discussions. Thank you very much, UNCITRAL. Thank you, Joubin-Bret, for giving this opportunity to speak. And also, these things which are presented by ours and other members, other states, we would like them to become the foundations for the legal amendments happening in our countries, so that they could become the basis for UNCITRAL help to our organizations and countries. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. And we are happy to invite you to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gershanok. And now on behalf of UNCITRAL and on behalf of our secretary, I would like first to thank the International Comparative Law Research Center of the Russian Federation for their support in organizing this webinar, for the technical support, and also for their input to the program. And the General Director, Madame Salugina-Sorokovaya, for her remarks. Thanking obviously the Russian Ministry of Economic Development for bringing this proposal to UNCITRAL, and which gives us the opportunity for sharing the experiences here. I'd like to thank every one of the speakers for their very informative presentations, for the replies to the questionnaire, and for their willingness to devote so much of your precious time to us, and for being such loyal supporters of UNCITRAL and its work. So with that, I thank you very much, and thank you for all that I have learned from you, and look forward to our next discussions. Thank you very much, and I close the webinar. Oh, Madame Joubin-Bret, please.
It was just clapping to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I close the webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye.